Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm glad to see so many familiar faces and these high dynamics of our discussions. Liubov, thank you very much for your wonderful study that was requested by the International Forum of Cultural Diplomacy. The Ukrainian Institute systemically works contributing to find out how Russian narratives penetrate throughout different countries. And we're talking about how the so-called diplomacy of Russians works in the world. There's Garchikov Foundation and the Russian World. You can read about that on the Ukrainian Institute's website. And then in a few weeks, we're going to present a new study as to the Russian cultural diplomacy in Germany proper. And the first question or first issue, and I would like to start with you, and I would like to start with the argument by the minister who said that he said a few hours ago, the minister said that we are lacking strategic understanding on how to build up the single voice of Ukraine, one voice of Ukraine abroad, because you've got a lot of state communication experience. So the question is, how do you see it playing your role as an advisor to the foreign minister? Yes, we're pretty conscious of the challenges and resources, but why has the minister understood the importance of long-term strategic thinking? Because we are countered by a propaganda machine with a huge resource, and Liubov has painted pretty well, pretty much in detail, on the narratives and the capabilities that they can afford covering all the regions, whole regions with communication, not high quality, but the resource is huge. In which conditions, what can we use to stand against that enemy informatively? What can we counter? We can take our professionalism, then our pertinence, our hard work. Then number two is reason, building of a single signal. I will talk in more detail what it is. Then in technology. In other words, that makes those advantages which also pertain to battlefield, like we're lesser in number, we're outnumbered, outgunned, but we can create symmetric advantages and create disadvantages to them when it comes to being abroad, for example. For example, we have instruments, tools to analyze our partner organizations, like search queries, and we can see what people query on Google, what they search on Google in different regions as related to certain themes related to Ukraine and the Russian aggression. It is much easier to talk to the people and sort of what they in particular search about the theme rather than it weighs down on them. So because that's often boils down to very generic things, and we need to urge everyone, the civil society sector, for example, to work with grand narrative, because we often go into those things like ecocide, military war crimes, like very, very specific themes that are very important. But what are Russians doing during this? At the same time, that they very earnestly grand narrative. So why has Russia attacked Ukraine? Because NATO was expanding, because Ukraine wanted to join NATO. Not true, but pretty attractive, you know. We made those attempts, like our partners, Ukraine, UA, try to answer those general questions, and we need to work with that narrative.
And a couple of words about one voice approach. We've been cooperating with Liubov for many years, and together we arrived at the conclusion that this is the tactics of the bees. So so many efforts are aimed at promoting the single goal. So the civil societies, the ministries, the common people participate in this promotion. So this is the model of the decentralized beehive. I think that this model can this can be a working model. I just believe that the civil society organizations should focus more on coordination of efforts. Only then we can counterbalance this huge propaganda machine. You mentioned NGOs, but I would like also to talk about performers and artists and other creative sector workers. What place cultural diplomacy should occupy within the state policy? Cultural diplomacy has many examples. One of them is the performance given by Ukrainian orchestra during the World War I. So what is happening since 2022? Ukrainian situation was covered in the media broadly. So hundreds of millions of people across the globe learned simultaneously about the existence of Ukraine. Yet Ukraine, this name is not filled with senses for everyone. Nobody understands why it fights the enemy, why it is so resistant, why it is so resilient. So the cultural diplomacy helps fill in this image with senses. This is a long-term initiative. Sometimes we are lacking time. We try to play with the narratives of the past and the narratives of the present. So why empire is more outcompeting the democracy sometimes, because empire has centuries. They are ready to gain centimeters of territory. Sometimes if you listen to their public statements, you hear such things as we don't care if it takes us 10 years to make progress. So we have to learn how to employ long-term narratives. So cultural diplomacy is pretty useful in this respect. I used to work in the public and cultural diplomacy unit, the ministry. So the Ukrainian Institute is able to participate in these useful projects explaining the entire world what it is all about. So one of the closest partners of Ukrainian Institute is the public diplomacy department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's true. So we are speaking with one voice, but we would like to engage more institutions to join in. Emma, now over to you. I have a question for you about the cultural diplomacy. How can it be used when counteracting disinformation? From your point of view, you've been active as a journalist, international journalist for many years. You are also engaged in the cultural sphere. So, in your opinion, what content does Ukraine lack? What content is needed to debunk the myths and stereotypes surrounding Ukraine?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be here on such a distinguished panel. You know, one of the things that that I think is really interesting is sort of separating between disinformation that's completely false and then something that is Russia sort of using a narrative that might have its roots in truth to shape a form of disinformation. And one area where I think you really see that is attitudes to Ukraine in the global south. And I mean, this is perhaps something that Sérgio might be able to talk about more, but I think it's really interesting if you look at, that's an area where Ukraine really struggles for support. And it's so interesting that several people have mentioned the fight against the Russian Empire, but in many places, this is not seen as an anti-imperial war, as you say. And this false disinformation narrative that this was a war provoked by Ukraine is rooted in part in lack of understanding about its nature. And I think to understand why that particular narrative has such a hold in so many countries, you have to go back to something which is true, which is that when these countries were involved in their own anti-colonial struggles sort of half a century or more ago, the one place that was willing to help them against empires like the British Empire, the French, all of Europe, was in fact the USSR, a sort of different incarnation of the Russian Empire. And, for people, for instance, South Africans who fought long and hard against the apartheid regime, the people who gave them money, who gave them weapons, who backed them diplomatically was the USSR. And, when you look at who's supporting Ukraine at the moment, I think it's very confusing. If you're telling someone, in South Africa or in India, this is an anti-imperial struggle, maybe someone who's not engaging with it very deeply. And then they see that, a big supporter of Ukraine is someone like Boris Johnson, who's very proud of the British Empire's imperial history. And we'll talk about that. I think it's very hard for people. They think, well, if this guy who's such a big fan of empire is supporting Ukraine, why should we take what they're saying about this being an anti-imperial war true? This is someone who's advocating for an empire that in our country caused great damage, great loss of life. If you think about the British Empire in India, for instance. And so I think, there's a really pressing need to engage in that. And, talking about narratives, it's interesting. I don't think Boris Johnson would ever, and his support for Ukraine's obviously been very important, but I don't think he would ever engage with or present this as an anti-imperial or anti-colonial war. He would present it as a war for liberal democracy. And that's the framing within which he is able to sort of enthusiastically support it without perhaps questioning his own core beliefs. And, sort of working out how to maintain your support, which is obviously essential from people like Boris Johnson, as, particularly when he was Prime Minister, while also engaging with the reality of what support from the Soviet Union meant to many, many anti-colonial and imperial struggles in other parts of the world is really difficult, but I think really important for Ukraine to do when it's looking to shore up its support worldwide. And I just add one more thing. I think the One Voice project is both important, but also as a journalist, my instinctive thought is one of the things that's so brilliant and important about Ukraine is that it's a democracy, and you always have to be a bit careful. You want to present it, you have a strong message, but you want to make sure that the reality that this is a diverse, pluralistic place is also reflected while you're getting the message across. And I think that kind of, is potentially challenging, right? Trying to be unified, but not monolithic.
Emma, я маю ще одне додаткове питання.
Emma, I have another question for you.
Ви говорите про різні
You are talking about various contexts, various messages in various contexts. Yes, indeed, we do have to consider that factor when working in other countries. Coming back to Britain and traditional online media and social networks, in what way can Ukrainian cultural actors penetrate foreign platforms, and what messages should they bring with them?
So thank you again. It's a really interesting question. And again, I'm slightly going to step back from the actual question, because I think the bigger problem is that we live in a world where these platforms are not regulated, and really nobody the one place that might have the power to regulate Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, or sorry, X, is the United States. That's where they're based. That's where they sort of have their headquarters. And it's really shown very little inclination to do so. It's fascinating, the fight that you've seen in Brazil. I mean, I'm really, wanting to hear more about that they've really taken on Twitter and for the first time sort of seem to have won. But I think the problem about tackling disinformation on these platforms is that they don't want to. And, for instance, you see it with Facebook. In Germany, where Holocaust denial is a crime, there is much more money put in by social media platforms into regulating content. So they can do it. It's just expensive. And you see the money, the time, the effort that goes into sort of moderating and regulating, even in countries that are relatively rich and able to hold them to account, is not what critics think it should be, including me. And then you see the places that don't have so much money, particularly countries in the global south, emerging democracies, which are in fact more vulnerable, arguably, to disinformation, or even they get less attention, less moderators speaking their language, smaller teams, so there's less sophisticated understanding of the political landscape to control it. So, I mean, I think in a way there's trying to get your messages out. And I'm kind of old and old school, so I'm not great at social media. I'm good at conventional media. But I think even beyond that, it's really important for Ukraine to be part of a sort of global movement, really. And perhaps this is somewhere there is common cause with other democracies in the global south to try and make these companies accountable. And they're just too big for most countries to do it on their own. The EU is trying, and that's going to be an interesting battle to see how it plays out.
Дякую. Серджіо, переходячи до вас,
Sergio, now over to you. We have mentioned Brazil and Latin America, this region in general. So, the cultural institutions have become active and systemic in these countries quite recently. Now, we are reinventing, rediscovering each other. So, I mean, Ukrainian culture is rediscovered by Brazil. So, it is important to have the reciprocity. We want Brazil culture to be rediscovered in Ukraine. What's important? We would like to work we are going to work in the country which has zero understanding of Ukraine or minus understanding. The information about Ukraine has always been disinformation because it was not supplied by Ukraine. We know that Russia has worked in Brazil with narratives about Ukraine. What kind of narratives?
Thank you very much. I'm very honored as well to be here. And may I disagree a little bit? I think Brazil, we had a sense that, I disagree when people say, oh, they didn't know what Ukraine was. They did. We have thousands of Ukrainians in Brazil. And we know that Ukraine is a country. We know that Ukraine is a different country from Russia, if that's, the common sense, the common. But, and I think Emma said, what you said was very, you went to the point when you say that this former Soviet Union was the one helping Brazilians to fight a dictatorship in the past. But I would like to add something. I don't think people in general have like, oh, we love Soviet Union because they helped us. No, I think they know in general, like the good right and the good left in Brazil. I'm taking out the extremes, but I know that I identify who the bad guys are. And this what's happening now in Ukraine, they know what's happening. They know who is invading. They know who is being invaded. They know the big picture. They might not know the specifics, but they know the big picture. If you can get that in every single public pool in Brazil. And well, I'm covering this country I've been covering since 2014. As I told you, I was in Crimea, Donetsk, and I'm part of this actually, to bring to the Brazilian public things that are happening here. But I think on the other hand, there is a lack of comprehension from Ukraine and from Europeans as well. What's the Brazil position? And I understand why sometimes it's confusing, because Brazil is a friend of Russia. Your BRICS, so you might be a very good friend of Russia. Brazil, you might not know, Brazil is the only BRICS country actually who is voting against Russia in the UN resolutions. That's something. So morally, and I heard that from a Brazilian diplomat the other day, morally, Brazil is supporting Ukraine. Brazil has a different approach on sanctions, on weapons. Brazil, and I'm not talking here on behalf of the government. Let's make it clear. I'm not the government, but I'm just explaining that they have a different approach on that. And sometimes I think both sides, they see the world black and white very much, and that's one of the difficult things to develop the conversation. I think the basic, which is like who is the bad guy, who is invading who, we agree on that. But and I understand why Ukrainians think like this Brazilian China proposal, say, okay, let's stop and talk. When you say that, if you say that to a normal Brazilian person, if you sit on a bar over a beer and you say, hey, don't you think that they should stop and talk? So, yes, why not? And then you say, so they don't want to stop now because they don't want to leave their land with Russia while they talk. And then you say, but they are dying. Shouldn't they stop? Our way to perceive things, and I know your perspective because I've been here many times. I know the European perspective because I live in London, but I know the Brazilian perspective because I'm there. And you know what? Each one of them makes sense if you take their own perspective. So I think the lack of understanding is mainly because of the lack of understanding the context, the perspective.
Я тут абсолютно з вами погоджуюсь, бо
Yeah, I fully agree here. That's what I notice sometimes. Some experts in Ukraine try to replicate the experience they gained in the European countries or Northern Africa. They are trying to apply this experience to the Asian or African, Latin American countries. Definitely this won't work. But then I have a question. What approach should the Ukrainian cultural diplomacy adopt towards working in Brazil?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't expect and I wouldn't approach Latin Americans and Asians or Africans the same way you approach Europeans. We are not follow Europe. We are not follow US straight away. We are different. We are part of America. We are Americans as well, as you know, although they call America a country, but America is a continent, and but we are not going to follow. This is for us, this is a sense of self-respect almost. So, but I think we have lots in common, knowing the Ukrainian people as I do, the Brazilians as I do, I think we have lots of ground to talk about. Maybe, and I know some of you might not believe that, we might be closer to Ukraine than we are to Russia. Because of our values. And that's something interesting. We are a democracy. That's something that holds us together, So I think the approach is that we have to go to Brazil, you have to talk to Brazilians, and we love to talk. So, yeah, go there and talk to us. We are ready to listen.
Дякую, це абсолютно так.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely true. And now I have the question for Liubov. I would like to talk about another perspective. You are knowledgeable about the context of other countries, but once again, we are talking about really diverse geography. You have outlined the problem, you have given us a picture of Russian so-called cultural diplomacy and their way to disseminate disinformation or misinformation. We know what the Ukrainian society should do. We should counteract, but what particular measures can be taken? I think there is no magic wand that can be used to change everything overnight. The main thing is to be consistent. The consistency does not mean the change of narratives of actors with the change of ministers.
Then another one comes instead of him and crosses things out. The communication strategy over the last 3 years, and I keep saying it, I see it in the armed forces. Like there's like the fourth brand book, number 4 strategy, communication 8, and so on and so forth, and they're never together in the middle of the armed forces. Those commands that are responsible for communication, and they go have deliberations, but they never visit with each other, and that pertains to the armed forces, to whatever, to whoever. Those ministries are friends, and those ones are not. Those ones are exchanging information, those ones are not. So it's good to be together with civil society. Now this liaison is much weaker compared to back in 22, when every one of us was going in the right direction, the same direction, but within the same government there should be like incorporation, unification, and then working without duplication of efforts on projects, because it will be a waste of human resource, a waste of budget, a waste of time. But if you rewrite things compared to what was done before, and the Russians are working, as Georg said, they work with personality, like Malevich, Russian artist, will hold out for 20 years as a narrative, and their policy has been designed and appointed for 20 and 30 years up ahead, and it does work. So why do the narratives like that work? Why do Russian narratives work? Because they keep repeating themselves from all sides, from everywhere. Every iron broadcasts it. And over time, that really gets wrapped in their heads. Like a million times you say Sevastopol is a Russian city, then at a point of time you're inclined to believe that, and that's confirmed by psychological studies. Well, we're together sitting here, and if on the off chance everyone keeps saying that 2 and 2 is 5, then I will first say to myself it's 4, and then the more you insist, the more I doubt. Then the second thing to point out, apart from the consequity, that's institutional capability and understanding of context. We badly understand and badly learn those contexts. If, for example, I come into a room and you're having a tea party with teacups, and on your T-shirt there will be it will say I love tea. It will be a little bit uncomfortable not to take a cup of tea out and like it, and they get into this country, and this here is anti-Israeli narratives, and this here is anti-Nazi. So okay, let's take advantage. They come to Arab countries and they say we're a little Israel, and the people don't understand what it is like being a little Israel. So changing context and like learning the context is different throughout entirely across the way, but you can create it and in your favor. You can use it in your favor. You can take advantage of it. And I can't not mention another study that the Ukrainian Institute is doing in every country where we work with this system. We study on how well Ukraine is accepted, and now we got a whole of 8 countries, 8 studies on 8 countries. Next year you will be able to see the results, and we got quite a few minutes for just one or two questions. Please raise your hands if you want to ask. Good afternoon. Just two short questions for Emma and for Sérgio. For Emma, that was about the recent racial protests in the UK, and we saw that the Russians did work there. So what do you think is the readiness of British society to understand that is the Russians that do meddle, and that we do need to understand that disinformation is only one of multiple parts of the hybrid war. We're talking about debunking and whatever, but the strongest effort should be on the hard measures. And Russian propaganda, that was for Emma, and for Sérgio, that's the Ukrainian diaspora in Brazil, because there is one city in Brazil where the regional regional language is Ukrainian, and the question is, how does the government of Brazil deal with the Ukrainian diaspora? And we're going to take another question right away. That's that the man in a suit. He was the first one.
Thank you very much. Vitaly Pashenko of the Institute of International Relations. My question also will be to Mr. Utsch concerning Brazil. And just earlier, our foreign minister said that it's about time that we move from the Euro-centered approach towards more global, oriented towards Africa, Latin America, and Asia. In terms of narratives, what will be more effective in the Brazilian context? We talked about imperial, anti-imperial struggle for liberal democracy. Does Brazil have this phantom pain of being a part of an empire, or will that narrative not be successful in the Brazilian context? Thank you.
Thank you. Emma, Sérgio, who wanted to be first?
Yeah. Shall I just very quickly address the one to me, as you've got two said here? So I haven't covered the rioting in the UK, so I can't comment directly on what didn't happen, because I've been out of the country. But I think certainly we are sort of having a long, slow reckoning with disinformation, the power of social media, not just as regards Russia, but I think since the full-scale invasion began, there's been greater domestic scrutiny of the extent to which you've seen oligarchs coming to the UK using it to launder money and reputations. So I think that's one thing, sort of questioning our own. I think our papers tried to do some of that. Perhaps we haven't done enough collectively as a society. We've done quite a lot at The Guardian. But in terms of social media, that's sort of a separate thing that perhaps just comes back to what I was saying earlier. I think we haven't fully understood as a society how dangerous it is and how much we need regulation. And I don't think there's enough of a political push, regardless of whether that disinformation is coming from Russia or anywhere else. Disinformation that's trying to undermine a democracy. We just haven't transitioned from a world where our laws, our regulations, from a world where media was just a few sources and could be controlled. If you wanted to spread a conspiracy theory 30 years ago, you'd had to print your own magazine, which would have looked really amateur, and you'd had to persuade someone to sell it or go and stand on the street corner looking kind of crazy saying, buy my magazine. Now you have a conspiracy theory, you can make a great website that looks pretty professional and get it shared on Facebook really quickly. So the ability to disseminate, I think we just have not reckoned with. And I think it's a very good question, really. And all I can say is I wish it was more of a focus for us.
Well, about the Brazilian, Ukrainian diaspora, I think they are treated as many communities are, like respectfully. I don't have any reason to think they are treated differently. We have the biggest Japanese community outside Japan. My family, my family is half German, half Portuguese. We are a mix of everything. So the Ukrainians are there like since, I don't know when, the last 100-something years. And we have people from everywhere, actually. We are half Black, we are half African. That's something very interesting in Brazil right now, because we are recognizing ourselves not as Europeans, but as Africans as well. And I think this is very interesting. So we have like our proper identity revolution right now. But I think, and we love them, and we love Borscht. I love it. And the other question, I don't know if I have, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a strategist on this matter, but as I said before, what people are, like that, if you sit with, when I sit with some friends in Brazil, and they always come to me to ask about Ukraine, and the question I hear the most is like, Sérgio, why they don't stop fighting? Why they don't talk? Why they don't negotiate? Because so they won't die. If there is no fight, there is no death. And it makes sense when people ask me that. I think if I were Ukrainian, I would try to explain people better why you don't want to stop fighting now. That's the thing. Because in people's minds, I'm saying, why they want to die? That's what people ask, straight away. Why they want to, because both sides are dying, but it's where they are making this huge sacrifice. It's not only a piece of land. I know it's much more than that, but I'm not as Ukrainian as you are to explain.
Дякую. Я хочу, щоб ми пішли на
And I want us to have lunch. I want us to have lunch, understanding the important things that our speakers have spoken about, that the systemicity, that the context, that's one solid voice or single voice policy, asymmetric decisions. One of the important methods and that underlies how we can fight the Russian Federation. Okay.